Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Trey Hester, Digital Director for War on the Rocks. Where are we 18 years after 9/11? What is the nature of the phenomenon of terrorism now, and what challenges does America face today? Paul Pope, Senior Fellow of the Intelligence Studies Project, moderates a panel on Counter-Terrorism Since 9/11. Paul is joined by John Brennan, former CIA Director, retired Admiral William McRaven, former Commander of the Special Operations Command, Farah Pandith, author and former National Security Council and State Department official, and Nicholas Rasmussen, former National Counter-Terrorism Center Director. This talk took place at the University of Texas at Austin and was sponsored by the Intelligence Studies Project, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and the Clements Center for National Security. Enjoy the show.
I want to go ahead and get started because we have a limited amount of time, and each one of these panelists could take the full amount of time and keep us captivated talking about this issue, given their expertise. But what I thought I would do is start with Director Brennan and Nick Rasmussen, Director of NCTC, former director, and ask what's changed. I mean, I think everybody has kept up with terrorism, but what is the nature of the phenomenon now? How has it changed? What challenges do we have? And what does that mean for us going forward? I'll start with John. You want?
Well, maybe I'll start. And I'm holding my phone not because I'm not paying attention, but because I wanted to read one sentence, and I didn't want to get it wrong, so I thought I'd hold my phone and get it right. The Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, a think tank, CSIS, last fall published a study, and the signature line at the top of that study said the following: despite nearly 2 decades of U.S.-led counterterrorism operations, there are nearly 4 times as many Sunni Islamic militants today as there were on September 11th, 2001. And I cite that statistic not to frighten people or to try to hype the threat. And again, sometimes when I was the director of National Counterterrorism Center, it was my job to go in front of various audiences and explain the threat as we understood it. And often I could be accused of hyping that threat, cataloging all the different ways in which we were at risk at home and around the world. That stat doesn't make me, on its own, feel any worse about the threat, in part because we've done so much as a nation since 9/11 to increase our defenses, to make ourselves a hard target, to increase our capability to go play both offense and defense in our counterterrorism operations around the world. But I cite that statistic because I think it's an important statistic to remember as you think about where terrorism and counterterrorism fit into the broader national security landscape, and I know that's a direction Paul wanted to take us in with this panel today. Because if you are working in the counterterrorism domain, what that statistic tells me is that you're not going anywhere. This issue, this phenomenon is going to be a central feature, not the only feature, but a central feature of our national security landscape for the foreseeable future. And I would say the foreseeable future to me means certainly a 10 to 20 year time horizon. And why is that important? That's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's important because the work we do in counterterrorism, while important, is expensive. The money we have spent as a country, the resources we continue to devote to this problem, don't come cheaply. They don't come cheaply in terms of the lives of young men and women who sacrifice their lives to defend us around the world, but also to build the kind of exquisite intelligence and defense capabilities needed to allow CIA to do what it does, to allow our special operations community to do what it does, again, doesn't come cheaply. And so as we enter a period where the terrorism problem sits alongside half a dozen other really, really pressing national security issues, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, cyber threats. What that tells you is that we will have to have a more sophisticated and intelligent conversation about resource allocation across our different problem sets. Not that we're going to get out of the business of counterterrorism, but how do we do it in a way that is smarter? Because I think this generation of new counterterrorism officials entering public service now will be the first ones that actually have to deal with resources in either a flat or a declining environment. My successor in my role as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Vice Admiral retired Joe McGuire, is the first person to occupy that role who I suspect won't get everything he asks for just because he asked for it. because there will be competing pressures on personnel, on budget resources, on talent in the community. And so we are going to have to, in my mind, be smarter about how we do countering extremism work and counterterrorism work. Of course, that gets to some of the themes that Farah will bring out that are very well developed in her book. Last thing I'll say on this before flipping it to my good friend John Brennan is that for most Americans now, if you're talking about the terrorism set of issues, you are at least as much thinking about domestic terrorism as you are thinking about jihadists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, which has, of course, been the kind of the stock and trade of our business for most of the period since 9/11. And that's as it should be, because, of course, that's the problem that here inside the United States seems to be the most pressing. It is certainly that form of terrorism that has cost the most American lives in recent years. It is that form of terrorism that, if you listen to FBI Director Wray, has caught up in terms of the caseload that the FBI manages around the country. And so that's something that I would argue, and we can talk about this again later in the conversation, our government is not as well postured to deal with that form of terrorism as we are postured to deal with the form of international terrorism that we've been dealing with in the period since 9/11. Right now, when we talk about domestic terrorism, most of the federal government agencies push back from the table and look at the FBI and say, over to you guys, because we treat it as a law enforcement problem and a law enforcement challenge. And we don't bring the same whole of government spirit that we bring to the terrorism problem when we're talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or managing our set of problems around the world in places like Afghanistan or Yemen or Iraq or Syria. So I'll leave it there. Happy to come back to any of these themes as we go through the conversation.
Everything he said, I agree with. But let me point out one thing that has changed and one thing that has stayed the same from my perspective since 9/11. One thing that really has changed significantly is that I believe it's much more difficult for terrorist groups to operate internationally now than it was back in 9/11 because of the tremendous advancements in intelligence collection and sharing, not just within the U.S. federal government, but with state and locals, but also with countries around the world. There is a tremendous flow of information in terms of who's involved in these various terrorist groups and actions to prevent them from operating either physically across borders or even in that digital domain, because of tremendous capabilities been brought to bear by a series of administrations since 9/11 that have tried to build upon some of those early efforts to prevent and to make much more difficult these terrorist groups operating internationally. What has happened with some of these groups is that they have burrowed into some of the local environments. So, for example, Al-Qaeda in Yemen is engaged in basically a civil war inside of Yemen. They don't have, at least right now, the same extent of their international sort of objectives that they had before. They're consumed with some of the local issues, whether it be inside of Yemen or Syria, Iraq, or even places in Africa. So I just think that there has been great progress. Certainly this country is much more difficult for terrorist groups to operate in today, foreign terrorist groups, than it was back in 9/11. Not saying it's impossible. Nothing is ever impossible. But there has been tremendous progress made. The thing that has stayed the same when I look out over the global stage that I was involved in, there's still, in many countries of the world, particularly in the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, tremendous amounts of economic deprivation, political discontent, social injustice, other types of things that are now being still repressed by governments that are trying to prevent a development of sort of democratic principles in some of these countries. So they're continuing to suppress these opposition groups within those countries. And similar to in the 9/11 period of time, the only available outlet for a lot of these individuals is to gravitate towards some of these groups that have a real purported religious foundation, extremism. When I was growing up back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you had secular groups. You had Baathism and Nasserism and socialism and communism, and you had these efforts to try to, gain some type of political traction through the secular organizations. You look now throughout the Middle East, all those other isms went away. It's just, the extremism that is associated with those individuals who, again, purport to be trying to carry out a religious banner under, whether it be an Islamic banner or a Hindu banner or someone else. So as Nick was pointing out, I think we still have a lot of challenges out there, how to deal with the violent expression of these groups who are upset about what's going on because of the corruption, because of the political suppression that is going on in their countries. And too often, a lot of these individuals who, again, purport to be religious zealots are able to galvanize people in support of their aims and have a violent expression. And so, as was pointed out earlier, it's not just a question of being able to address the violent manifestations of this phenomenon. It is trying to understand and to address better those upstream factors and conditions that really contribute to that violent expression that comes out of those terrorist and extremist organizations. This is going to, I think, challenge us for many, many years to come. And that's why in the intelligence community and CIA and other places, yes, we need to keep thinking about what's going on with Russia or China, North Korea, whatever else. But the globe has just a wide array of challenges and groups that are going to try to advance their interests by using violence, in some instances, catastrophic violence if they can do it, something that the intelligence community need to be continually working on and cannot think that we're past this challenge.
Yeah, if I could just paraphrase a couple of things that came out of this. I mean, I think we have this fundamental contradiction that we have not had a major attack like 9/11 since 9/11, and yet we have the numbers that you're describing, Nick. And so if you read the national security strategy or the defense strategy, we have explicitly what we're referring to in the strategies said counterterrorism is not it's not the top priority. So these other near peer states are the priority for defense. So with that in mind, I want to switch to sort of what do we do about it, or how do we adjust our counterterrorism policy, strategies, tactics, and that kind of thing going forward. And I thought I'd turn to Admiral McCraven first, and then Farad to talk to that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, when I got to the White House in October of 2001, I was a Navy captain, just come out of Major Command, and I arrive on the NSC staff. And I'm given the job of being the lead author on the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism. So this was, we are going to defeat terrorism. We're going to defeat terrorism. I thought, okay, so I'm going to put my military strategy together and think about it in military terms. And in the course of pulling some great thinkers across the State Department, the intelligence community, National Defense University, pulled all these folks in, and we went through a lot. But the best advice I had was actually from a 34-year-old Harvard PhD who happened to be on the staff, the Homeland Security staff. And he said, you're thinking about it all wrong. He said, I spent a lot of time in New York City, and he worked with kind of disaster response in New York City, particularly fires. He said, you have to think of terrorism like you think about fires. We are never, ever going to eradicate all fires. We just aren't. We'd like to say that there will never be another fire again, but there will be fires. So how do you deal with fire security, fire safety in the city of New York? Well, one, you make sure that you address the conditions that cause fire, bad wiring, dilapidated buildings. You want to make sure you got smoke detectors in the event there is a fire, and then you want to have a fire brigade that can come and put out the fire. Think about it like that. And so when you began to think about, okay, look, let's accept the fact that there's never going to be a surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. Now what we have to figure out is how do we address, to John's point, the underlying conditions, what's kind of causing the fires. It's not always about poverty. If it was about poverty, then you'd find Haiti to be a hotbed of terrorism. But it is about social conditions, so how do you address that? What are the smoke detectors? What does our intelligence community look like? How are we going to determine whether or not smoke is building and a fire is building? And then do we have the forces, the counterterrorism forces, the law enforcement forces, the soft power to be able to go in and address the terrorism problem? So once you begin to kind of take a look at it in that framework, then you can begin to see maybe how best to address the problem. Having said that, we laid that all out in the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism. I think 5 people probably read it, me being one of them. Having said that, I think it was a good strategy because a lot of it was about by, with, and through. It was about recognizing, we use this term, particularly in the special forces, the Green Berets like to talk about by, with, and through. In other words, what we need to do is we need to work with the host nation to teach their forces, their security forces, their law enforcement forces, their embassy folks, how best to address the problems. Let them do it. We need to be coaching and mentoring, but at the end of the day, it's going to be about a problem generally within a confined piece of territory. work it by, with, and through. And then, of course, you're always looking at the difference between capability and intent. And a lot of times we have gone after terrorist organizations that had all the intent in the world, but frankly had very little capability. And then you go and you waste a lot of your resources tracking down folks that may have intent but not capability. So how do you make sure you're prioritizing those that have capability and intent, and then working by, with, and through? And I think that model in general is still good. It has certainly served us well in light of the fact that we have not had a major attack on U.S. soil. So I think we've made some tremendous strides since 9/11. But anybody that thinks that this war is going to be over soon is mistaken. This is, as I've said many times before, this is a generational fight. We're going to be fighting fires for as long as there are people on the earth, and those fires could get worse.
Well, that's a great segue to Thora.
So one of the things that's important in everything that you've heard is the attention to detail in terms of what you need to do to fight a war. And the war that we are fighting, from my perspective, is a war of us versus them ideology. And we have been lazy on hate and lazy on the ideology component of what we've seen since 9/11. Let me be clear. We are talking about 9/11, so some of the threat, a lot of the threat, is coming from terrorist organizations that use the name of Islam to recruit young Muslims. But they're not the only extremists that are out there. And today, almost 20 years since 9/11, the kind of extremist threat we're dealing with is not just a group like AQ or the so-called Islamic State or the Taliban or Boko Haram, but we also now see the rise of other kinds of extremists. The work that I've been doing since 9/11 has been focusing on the young people, and the majority of the people I'm looking at the audience, I think, are under the age of 30. Millennials and Generation Z, you are the demographic from which the bad guys recruit. And in going to nearly 100 countries on behalf of our nation as special representative to Muslim communities and talking to young Muslims, the only data point that I saw consistently for Muslims living in Muslim majority countries and Muslims living as minorities is the issue of identity and belonging. And I say this because this goes to the issue of preventing fires. How do you build prevention if you don't understand what we're dealing with? How do you get young kids to own their identity in such a way that the bad guys can't come in and suck you in? That's the job we have to fight. That's what we need to be doing. Not just the kinetic component, which is essential, but to understand as government that in order to win this, to get not every terrorist away from the world, but to change the vast number of young people who find it interesting to join a group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And the only way to do that is to understand that the strategy means hard power and soft power combined. Nick started by quoting something from CSIS, and I am not part of CSIS, but I was part of a commission that found this number out, which I think is really sobering. In the fight against the so-called Islamic State, the U.S. government spent 0.0138% of its budget on trying to prevent recruitment. 0.0138%. We obviously know that in order to destroy the bad guys, we got to make sure that they don't have armies. And it costs us less to do that. Yet the U.S. government, since 9/11, has not deployed an effective, all-encompassing, cohesive, strategic, global effort on soft power. So the way to win this and what we need to do is to make sure that we are addressing this in an equal-handed way. We need to understand that the issue of identity and belonging is not the responsibility of just government. It's the responsibility of all of us. So I argue that the strategy that we need to think about is how to puncture the us versus them in communities around the world, not just in our country, because from my perspective, it's not a domestic threat versus an international threat. If you're a millennial sitting in Detroit or in Dhaka, you are online and you're connected. Ideas have no borders. You can't build an idea wall. So what do we have to do? We have to think about how to deploy government in new ways, and you talked about the organization of how we do that, the money that we need to do it, and we could go into great detail about all the things that we know and we've learned that the U.S. government needs to do. But we also need to talk to corporations. Technology companies, yes, but other corporations to think about how they are the touch points that they have in terms of how a young person thinks about themselves. There is a grand place for corporate purpose in all of this. And finally, and this sounds like the mushy-gushy stuff that government cannot deal with, they don't have metrics for, it's really awful. How do you get societies to fight hate? I mean, really, we're going to go around talking about compassion and empathy and being good to each other? Really, truly, we're going to measure this? Turns out you can measure it. And it turns out that cities across America and the world have begun to think about how to recalibrate this. And this is connected to the issue of what's happening in America today on the rise of hate. Because if you're a young kid and you're 16 years old and you're growing up in school and you are feeling like everybody is against you, you are more susceptible to the kind of ideology, whether it's an identitarian or whether it's the Taliban or Boko or pick your group. And finally, the last piece is this. We're talking in a static moment here on September 10th, 2019. Our job has been to think not just for now, but what's coming. And if we're going to build the antibodies in the system to prevent young kids, our kids, from joining these kinds of groups, we better get serious about the soft power component. And we aren't ready for that.
Thank you. We want to come back to a lot of that. I want to, before we go forward, looking at the future, I want to pause for a second and look back to 9/11 for just a minute and asking a particular question. And I'm going to go back to Captain McCraven writing the strategy. It's very clear if you listen to the Admiral that he understood that we couldn't kill our way out of that problem, and I'm sure you understood that. And that's a phrase that I heard many times over the last 2 decades. We can't kill our way out of this. People have long understood that we needed to have this other strategy, and a lot has been written, and there were a lot of meetings, and a lot of things were done. So I'm going to come back to you and say, how do we organize that? And then, well, let me ask another question before that. Does it take a catastrophe for us to make the changes? Or is this moment when we're re-examining strategy enough maybe to at least make some progress on that? And then second, how do we organize that in the government? I want the others to comment on that, but I wanted to come back to you for your thoughts on it.
I think that your immediate response as a human is, of course, a calamity is going to make everybody do everything right. And we have learned as Americans time and time, and I'm not getting political here, I'm just giving you points. You would have thought after Newtown that we would have changed the way we think about guns. A little bit. Okay, you would have thought after, the fires in the rainforest decades ago that we would have learned how to handle that. We would have thought with a health crisis like HIV/AIDS that we would have been able to handle the bird flu in a different way. I mean, we have had calamities, but our response system has been slow and it's been ad hoc. And it has not been a 24/7 machine. And so how we handle it today is not waiting, God forbid, for another 9/11. It's for leadership to think through who we want to be and how to get there. And I think that is possible. I think that there are lots of innovative, smart, intelligent, well-meaning people in our government today who are capable of building that kind of long-term plan. It needs 2 things right now. One is leadership from the top that says soft power matters and puts their money where their mouth is. This is not just the executive branch. I'm calling on Congress as well when I say this. What were you waiting for to give money to the soft power components of our government? And then the second is, and this is, with every plan that you build in the hard power domain, there is one person who wakes up every single day and knows where every satellite is, where every submarine is, where every troop is. There is no one in the U.S. government today, and nor has there been since 9/11, who wakes up and whose job it is to know how to deploy soft power. That is unbelievable. You cannot solve this problem if there's no leadership.
Thank you. I'd like others to comment on that. Nick, did you have some?
Let me jump in on the kind of the broader strategy question, because again, I sat alongside Bill at the time he was writing that fire prevention strategy in 2001, and I had my fingerprints on strategy documents in other administrations. And as I look back on that, with a lot of humility, because I think we're Where I see things now is very different from where I saw things then. I very much embrace the kind of prevention agenda that Farah is talking about, because when we've written strategies in the past, we've used very big words. We've used words like defeat and destroy and win, when in effect, as I think Bill had that kind of epiphany, that really wasn't an achievable objective, and that the goal ought to be to manage, to mitigate, to shrink, to contain, to kind of bring the problem down to the size where it can be certainly not an existential threat to the United States, but not even a preoccupying feature of our national security landscape. And to me, that ought to be the objective, rather than using these somewhat unattainable, and I would argue in the end misleading to the American public, words that somehow suggest that if we just do X, Y, and Z in 4 years' time, we will be past our set of terrorism problems and concerns. When again, I spoke about 2 years ago at my 30th college reunion, and I was a recipient of an award there, and I said my goal working on counterterrorism is to make you in this audience not think about what I do, and to have me worry about it along with my colleagues in government whose responsibility it is, but for you to be able to live your life without reference to what I do. Go to that 4th of July parade, go to that picnic, go to that football game without thinking about the security environment on that evening at that place. That to me is an attainable objective, and you don't have to identify and eliminate and remove every terrorist or extremist from the face of the earth in order to achieve that objective. But achieving that objective does involve the soft power tools that Farah is talking about. And in many cases, the federal government will simply be a catalyst or an enabler to communities around the country and arguably around the world in doing that kind of work. It's not a single program from Washington that is going to make communities all across this country more resilient. It is the government can provide resources, the government can provide expertise and backing, but in the end, this is a community level responsibility in many ways, and particularly when I'm talking about the set of domestic terrorism concerns I alluded to at the beginning, a lot of that responsibility will fall locally, not at the Washington level.
Did you want any comment on that, Director Brennan? Very good.
Yes, I think I do. I very much appreciate and applaud Farah's representation of trying to orchestrate soft power. There is a person in the United States government responsible for that. First of all, it's the President of the United States, but then it's the Secretary of State as well. Secretary of State is one who's supposed to be able to make sure that the United States' presence around the world is going to be as effective as possible. It's really hard. And the United States' ability to actually influence events overseas is limited. And I came to realize that in a very, very profound way when I worked at the White House and at CIA and others. We can do certain types of things. But also, as the United States goes into different countries, we're viewed as this sovereign power who now has changed over the last several years in terms of our own goals and objectives. And there is a taint, rightly or wrongly, with the U.S. hand that's coming into the countries, because they feel as though this is just the exploitation by those current-day imperial powers. When I was at the White House, as well as at CIA, I really was a strong advocate and worked with the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, that has this independence as well as a reputation of doing things not because they're trying to advance the interests of an individual power or country. It's because they're trying to do it for the betterment of humanity. And I do think trying to deal with some of these issues as we look across the globe over the next decades, that, and it's very unfortunate that there has been a diminishment of emphasis on multilateral institutions and initiatives in the last couple of years. Because I do think we have to take that sovereign aspect out of some of this and try to do things that are going to be really not just viewed as for the betterment of society and mankind, but truly are, which has to have more of an independent, unbiased sort of approach to some of these issues. And the United States, I think, has a particularly important role of trying to lead this effort on behalf of the world and of Western societies and liberal democratic order. But unfortunately, I think we have taken a step back because we're never going to be able to fight our way out of this, but we're also not going to be able to dictate solutions to these countries that are still beset by all these problems. And until we start to work with the private sector, but also with these international bodies and not disparage them, but actually try to lift them up and leverage them for the good of all, I think we're going to be, fighting almost a futile effort, war.
Anything else? Okay. I wanted to shift to some individual agencies, and if Nick, if you want to jump in, please do. But NCTC sort of exists; it's got terrorism in its name. But if you're SOCOM or you're CIA, you've played a huge role in counterterrorism and still have a huge role to play. But then these other missions that we were talking about earlier come in. So how do you reconcile that? And let me start with SOCOM. Is the resource picture okay, or how do you approach that, Admiral?
Yeah, one, I think the resource picture today is absolutely okay, but I want to get back to something Farah said, because frankly at SOCOM there is this expectation that we're a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and I think that is a very misleading view of the way Special Operations Command work. One, again, we have this Green Beret sort of culture, and for those of you that understand the history of the Green Beret fighting insurgencies, there's a lot of similarity between insurgencies and terrorism. And the insurgency model that we have used over the years that kind of comes from the British Malay model and others is actually a good model. You struggle with it in Iraq and you struggle with it in Afghanistan, but you understand that you have to have this balance between soft power and hard power. You have to go in, you have to build a relationship with the village elders or the tribal leaders. You've got to figure out how do you address the underlying conditions that cause the extremists to come in. So you're going to say, so where can we help you with wells and schools and building the stature of your community? But at the same time, make no mistake about it, the bad guys are trying to kill the village elders and they are trying to kill the tribal leaders. So somebody on the outside has got to be able to provide that security. That is hard power. So in the midst of looking at it locally, work with the village elders, but at the same time, you better put up gun positions and you better go out and kill the bad guys so that the village can begin to grow. And then we used to call it the old ink spot technique. You're going to start with one village, you're going to connect it with another village and another, and you're going to go from the village to the district, to the province, to the central government. Now, if you think about that model, and you think about terrorism worldwide as a pan-surgency, a global insurgency, then at least it gives you an intellectual framework to think about it. But in the special operations community, the first thing we want to do is go in and figure out what can we do to build boreholes, wells in Mali, so that we can, again, buy down some of the conditions where the extremists come in. How can we work with the locals to address some of these issues? Because we have money to do that. But then, at the same time, you've got to be prepared to balance that with hard power so that the goodness within the white spaces and the green spaces can grow. And I think that's true of any sort of approach you're going to have to take with terrorism.
I having been an Army guy, I have that sort of Green Beret view of SOCOM. But I also think that the commanders that are responsible for China and Russia would want you to be thinking about that as well and working on it. And I'm just wondering, is there anything you could tell us about how that should be balanced or could be balanced or is being balanced now as we go forward in the new defense era that we're in?
Well, one of the things I'm quick to point out is special operations forces are not the panacea to all problems. We can't stop the North Koreans from coming south. We can't keep the Straits of Hormuz open. We can't keep the Straits of Malacca open. There are things that special operations forces can't do or won't do very, very well. So we become a supporting commander to U.S. Forces Korea or to the Central Command, and I think we know how to do that very, very well. We have to understand where our niche is. Our niche is within the special operations arena, within the counterinsurgency and the counterterrorism arena, and I think we do that very well and we balance that well. But at the end of the day, there are large wars that will require special operations forces, but we will follow the lead of those conventional forces that know how to do that best.
Director Brennan, what about the agency and other IC community balancing this inside?
It's been a challenge for the agency ever since its founding.
Right.
That the CIA has global responsibilities, and at any given point in time, some parts of that globe are very hot and others are not so hot. And so you need to be able to pivot to deal with the challenges that emerge. But what you can't do is to neglect the rest of that globe, because the United States is unique in that it has global equities, global responsibilities, and the CIA is expected to provide insights if Look at Venezuela, what's happening there, other parts of the world. So you cannot neglect those areas. And I think over the course of our history, there have been times where we have drawn down significantly and precipitously some of those collection capabilities, whether they be human sources or technical collection systems or liaison relationships, that all of a sudden, for whatever reason, that part of the world heats up again. So although the emphasis in this administration is looking at those big power relationships, that always has been a focus of CIA. But to the point we're talking about earlier, you cannot forget that the Middle East and South Asia and Africa are rife with these types of problems regarding stability and terrorism and other things. So it's up to CIA leaders to decide, given your allocation of resources, how you're going to distribute that, how you're going to make some of that fungible, and how you're going to move things, but anticipate what you need to continue to invest in, because looking out over the next several years, sure as heck that CIA is going to be asked to do certain types of things that if you were to take those investments out, you're not going to be able to do it.
I wanted to shift. Several folks have mentioned domestic terrorism, and I wanted to talk about that for a minute. You talked about how extremism isn't just foreign jihadists. I was talking to Bobby Chesney about this recently, and from an authorities perspective, it's like taking hockey sticks to a basketball game. I mean, it's really different. It's not, CIA. You didn't say that. That's my thing, okay? But he's very sophisticated. But CIA can't be in the lead on that. JSOC's not going to be playing a big role in that. So I think there are lessons that can be learned, and sharing information is one of them, and enterprise leadership and other things. There's some kind of soft lessons that we can take. But how do we stand now to, the Bureau has done great work and is doing great work, but how should we shift now to think about domestic terrorism, and are we in good shape on that?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, because I have been doing some writing and thinking on this topic in recent months. And again, it starts from a place of huge admiration and respect for exactly what you just said, Paul, the FBI, because I think the FBI is the preeminent law enforcement organization in the world as far as I'm concerned. But my argument or complaint is certainly not with them. It has been with the fact that we've kind of left the playing field to them and to them alone in terms of dealing with this set of domestic terrorism concerns. And so how do we broaden that effort out so that it is a truly whole of government effort, so that you involve all of our domestic agencies, including agencies that wouldn't typically be involved in national security work, not just Homeland Security, which obviously is, but Department of Education, Health and Human Services, parts of our government that have reach into the mental health system at the state, national, and local level. All of these parts of our government, our federal government, have a role to play in dealing with the kind of community resilience problems Farah has been talking about. And all of these organizations, all of these government components have potentially resources they can bring to bear that would aid in this so-called prevention agenda. But it has to be led and directed from the center. And that's what I worry is not necessarily happening right now. Not too long ago, I was talking to some senior Department of Homeland Security officials who were stepping through for me and a couple of other people all of the things they at DHS are doing to try to bring real urgency to this domestic terrorism problem. Because I think at DHS, there are, in fact, people who want to do the right things and want to bring urgency to this. But they're not necessarily certain that they're doing so as part of a national effort, and that they are that they're plugged into something that is a White House-led or an NSC-led or Homeland Security Council-led effort. And I think that would not only be a much needed step towards greater U.S. government effort at the federal level, it would also send a powerful message to the American people that we're not just simply going to let these events happen every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks, throw up our hands and say, well, there it is again. But that we're actually going to try to take some steps and mobilize some resources to do something about it. Because imagine this, if each of those attacks over the last 6 months had involved a jihadist from tied to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we'd be having a very different response, a very different public debate about where we are in our war on terrorism than we have been having because these issues are labeled as domestic. And I think that's not fair to the American people. They should expect more of their leaders in Washington.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is the scare. On top of everything else that Nick talked about, one of the things that's also scary is that the threat isn't just staying as it is, right? These organizations are learning from each other, and even though they may hate each other, if you're a white supremacist organization here in the United States, you're looking at the playbook of the so-called Islamic State because you're saying, how did they use the online space to radicalize and sway people in a particular direction? It sounds absurd, but if you're a bad guy and you want to learn how to do things and do it well, you go to the successful models that are out there. So we're looking at a threat today that is a 50-state problem. And in 2016, I would turn everybody's attention to the fact that there is, in fact, the CVE task force that Jay Johnson put together came up with a 50-state plan that does all the state things that Nick just said about different parts of government taking part in this, thinking about this in a cohesive manner, not just looking at isolated parts of America in terms of what's happening, and importantly, not just isolated parts in the world that people think, oh, that's dangerous and that's dangerous because, as I said, ideas have no borders and they're connected. The other thing that I think, when I think about the solutions here that are, by the way, at our fingertips and are affordable and available right now, I think about something that Mr. Brennan was saying in terms of the localized communities. This isn't a top-down effort only. This has to be from the bottom up because the nuance and the very particular influence at a particular city or neighborhood makes a difference to how people absorb who they are, their identity, their belonging to that space. And I think on the domestic side, we need to get real as Americans about what it is we want to live with. What is okay? And is it all right to be in an environment in which we are not just seeing a political conversation about us versus them, but it's manifesting in the fourth graders or the 10th graders or the college freshmen and around our country that's changing the way they think about themselves because that opens up space for others. And the domestic terrorist organizations in our country today that were really small at one point that have now gained agency and have monopolized the conversation both offline and online are learning from the very best around the world. And that's what frightens me the most because like some of the groups that learned from the horrific events on July 22nd in Oslo, you will see things that begin in America make a difference to another part of the world. And then we will be the country that we will turn into the Saudi Arabia of the world on this kind of threat, because we will have seen it grow, spread, mature, and radicalize in a way that we had never seen, and it's having an effect in pick your country somewhere else. We haven't thought through what that's actually going to even mean for us. So when I look at all of this, I see a dangerous moment in time, but I think there is an opportunity, Paul, that we are not talking about, and that is, I think the vast majority of Americans believe in who we are as communities of diversity and the strength of what that means. And I think that this is a moment where we should be pushing on our elected officials and on our community officials to do more around that space. Because I think when you begin to build those kinds of antibodies in, you will see change in a real way.
Thank you.
Some of the students that I spoke to last night as well as this morning have already heard this, but you're going to have to hear it again. I'm a liberal arts guy, but I am a wannabe systems engineer. Because during my period of government, I came to realize just how big and powerful the United States government is and how unwieldy it is as well. And as we talk about these issues, whether we're talking about the exercise of soft power abroad or trying to address issues of domestic terrorism or gang violence or other things, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, State Department, SOCOM, Special Forces, other things. Having more is not necessarily better unless you design a system that is able to leverage optimally the different parts of that system in an integrated fashion so that you can actually apply those great capabilities, resources, and authorities against those issues. And as I've looked at it over the course of at least my career, the last 40 years, there has been explosive growth in capabilities and size of government, but I don't think we have done sufficient job of trying to design us the system of systems that's going to allow us to take full advantage of those capabilities. And it's very difficult because as administrations come in, you have usually a new group of folks who are just trying to figure out where's the restroom for the first couple of weeks, and then trying to make sure they understand that inventory of capabilities that are out there and how you're going to bring it together. And it's a very dynamic environment as technology continues to change capabilities. And too often, I think we have departmental structures, agency structures, that are not sufficiently interoperable and integrated with the rest of the government. When I look out over the next 20 years, 30 years, this is the challenge for the United States government. How are you going to bring to bear those capabilities that are going to give you the optimal outcomes by leveraging those capabilities you have, as opposed to either sub-optimizing, underutilizing, or in fact competition among the various agencies and departments? I don't have a solution to that. People who are out there who are systems engineers and those who are liberal arts people as well, you really need to be thinking about that environment that you're going to be operating within and how you're going to empower yourself and the rest of that environment by ensuring that there's going to be those relationships that are going to be mutually empowering.
About a year and a half ago, I led a professional research project, and we looked at some very similar questions to what you're discussing right now about the engineering of the systems to go after particular problems. And what we found was in the war on terrorism, very relevant, I think, to what we're talking about, is if you want to see what an exquisite interagency machine can look like, look at our manhunting machine that we put together. It's pretty impressive. We didn't have something like that on the other side. I want to ask you just a quick kind of a poll question, because what I'm hearing, I think implicit in your comments is optimism that we can do it, that there's, it's hard, but that it is a doable thing to make a lot of progress in this area if we turn our mind to it and make it a priority of government with leadership. So let me start with you. You're nodding your head the most. So are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I spent the last 3 years of my life writing this book because I believe we can do exactly what we can imagine, which is decrease and shrink the appeal of extremist ideology. We have the innovation, we have the talent, we just don't have the will. If we get the will on board, of course we can.
Nick, what do you think?
My optimism is tied to, as was said earlier, what's going on in that hallway outside. And that is, I think, still the national security enterprise is still able to attract the very best young men and women who want to serve their country, want to serve their fellow Americans. And so long as that continues unabated, I think some of the structural problems John rightly points to, we stand a much better chance of addressing those with those young people involved in developing solutions. That is not a tomorrow answer, but it is a reason for tremendous optimism over the long term.
Yeah, you've heard me say it a bunch of times before that I am the biggest fan of the millennials you'll ever meet. And I think that surprises folks because you hear this kind of narrative about the millennials that they are entitled and soft. And I'm quick to point out that you never saw them in a firefight in Afghanistan, or you never saw them going to school here at the University of Texas at El Paso or Rio Grande or Austin. This is a remarkable generation of young men and women. And you take a look at how they mobilize when they get upset. You look at the Parkland shooting, and whether or not you agree with the politics, imagine how they came together to march on Tallahassee, to march on D.C., because they felt passionate about something. I mean, this is a great trait in the young men and women that are out there. My concern, and you've heard me say this before, I'm often asked in settings like this, what's my number one national security concern? And people always think I'm going to answer that North Korea or Iran, and it's the same every time. It's K through 12 education. Because if we don't get K through 12 education right, then we have all the problems that the FAR is talking about. Because if you're not addressing the issues at that level, when they're starting in first grade or kindergarten on up, then one, we won't have to worry about national security because we won't have anybody that's thoughtful enough to think about the hard issues. So we've got to get K through 12 right. We've got to put the effort into there. And then we've got to empower these young men and women that are part of the millennials and Gen Z to do what they are going to do so very, very well.
Brennan,
As a wife who is focused on 0 to 5 education, I would say don't discount those before they even get to kindergarten, because
true.
especially in inner cities and other places, you need to be able to make them compete. As a grandfather, I can't help but be optimistic. Because I want to make sure that my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren are going to be able to take as much advantage of this great, wonderful country that I have been so privileged to be a part of for many years. But I'm also very much of a realist. And I recognize that the challenges ahead of us are formidable, and they're serious, and some of them are getting worse. We live in the most wonderful period of time ever, despite all of these problems. I mean, look at our daily lives, for most people anyway. There's been tremendous advancements. But there's still a lot of problems and issues that are out there, which is one of the reasons why I tend to get my Irish up when I talk sometimes about the politics in Washington, because I am just appalled at how politicians on both sides of the aisles are just focused on partisan agendas and trying to advance the interests of themselves or their parties, as opposed to doing what's in the best interests of this country. And until we get that right, until we fix that, this government is going to continue to be dysfunctional, and we're not going to be able to deal with these challenges as effectively as we need to in the future. And so I'm hoping that there's going to be a realization that this partisan fighting needs to stop, and that we need to come together as a country. I know that sounds sort of, Pollyannish, but until we do, we're not going to be able to make progress against any of these issues the way we need to. We have the capability to do it. Gets back to the will, but we need to have our leadership set an example for the rest of this country that we are a country of great privilege and great capabilities, but with that comes responsibility, and responsibility to the future generations of this country.
Can I jump in on just one piece of that? Because one of the encouraging trends, there aren't many encouraging trends in politics these days, but one encouraging trend you have seen is younger professionals, say mid-30s, who've had experience working national security problems, are going into politics. They're wanting to bring their talent home and actually do. Will Hurd, your congressman you had here in Texas, is a terrific example. But in the last Congress, there were easily 5, 6, 7 young such individuals who I served with across my time in government. Tom Malinowski in New Jersey, half a dozen others, who are deciding that they can bring the same kind of public-spirited commitment to domestic politics and politics itself that they brought to their national security work. That's a small step, but I think it's an important step. And you want to see people like that succeed. You want to see them reelected, because they bring that kind of sense of partisanship to their domestic work, to their politics, because they've seen that's how it works in the national security world.
Now, help me in thanking this esteemed panel and for the time they've given us today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. For a deeper dive into this episode and for access to exclusive content, check out the War on the Rocks members discussion board, the War Hall. To sign up, visit warontherocks.com/membership.